Have you seen the well-to-do up and down Park Avenue on that famous thoroughfare with their noses in the air? High hats and arrow collars, white spats and lots of dollars.
In the 1930s, there was a return to a more genteel, ladylike appearance. Bettling rounded busts and waistline curves were seen, and hair became softer and prettier as the perms improved. Foreheads, which had been hidden by cloche hats, were revealed and adorned with the small plate-shaped hats. Clothes were feminine, sweet, and tidy by day, with a return to real glamour at night. The gradual emancipation of women through the 1920s brought with it an independence of action, and there is no bolder way to express your femininity than with makeup. Without a doubt, the art of women's makeup took off in the strides during the 1930s with the help of Hollywood glamour and the new rage of full-color fashion magazines. Max Factor and Elizabeth Arden were becoming household names. The 1930s women's makeup look was much more refined than in the 1920s. Gone were the heavy coal eyes, and in came pencil-thin eyebrows and alluring pinks and shimmers. Mascara was now a necessity in a makeup kit, and the fashionable application techniques concentrated on the upper eyelashes, leaving the lower untouched. Eyeliner was traced from the tear duct with an upturned triangle effect. Eyeshadows became more pear-shaped with sweeping lines outwards to enlarge the eye. The face foundation in the 30s was complex like gardenia or tea rose, which were the most popular face foundations. Therefore, powders applied in rich ivory, light mauve, or with a slightly green touch. From the mid-30s on, women preferred ivory and varying tones of pink, light blue, and orange cream. The eyebrows were plucked thin or shaved off entirely. Then the eyebrows were drawn on with an eyebrow pencil extended well towards the temple. To give them a shiny look, eyebrows were then to be dressed with petroleum jelly or olive oil. The lipstick, up to the middle of the 30s, was very popular. The lipstick colors were light rose, raspberry tones, Chinese red, and orange tones. In the later 30s, primarily bright red tones were mostly used. The mouth should have full lips with an elongated bow that rounds and flares at the corners. This kind of mouth was called the rosebud mouth, bird mouth, or the cruller. Chris, dude, how you been? What are you doing?
Just doing my hair with this new Murray stuff I got down the street at Sally's barbershop.
Dude, no, can I try some out?
Yeah, go ahead.
My hair is awful, dude. Let me try some.
Wow.
Wow, let's
Just rub it in your finger.
Murray's.
Best pomade in the world.
Get some today at your local Sally Beauty Shop at 59th Street.
In the 1930s, hairstyles were becoming more feminine again, and the start of the decade marked the beginning of the Hollywood Golden Age. 1930s hairstyles were more soft and glamorous than the previous decade. At the start of the 1930s, women had quickly decided that they were no longer content with fighting against their female form and didn't want to continue the trend of the boyish look. Finger waves and pin curls are definitely the way to go if you want to recreate the 30s look. The waves were softer and framed the face. The softer and wavier, the better. The length of the hair was slightly longer than that of the 1920s bob. Joanne Crawford was a very popular actress and stylist icon who wore waves and curls in her hair. The typical 1930s hairstyle would be parted in the middle or on the side and worn under exquisite large brimmed and smaller hats. The 30s were associated with a lot of pomp and style. The evolution of hairstyles for men had witnessed its most rebellious upheaval during the 1930s. The World War, flashy bands, dancing, and fashion brought forth a new wave of hairstyle for men. The typical 1930s hairstyle for men can be described as short and sharp. The regular trips to the barber to cut their hair to keep up the sophistication connected to those times. The trend was to team up hats and caps with the vintage hairstyles and neatly tailored suits like the drape cut or the London drape. as it was the era of the Great Depression. Pompadour was no longer in fashion in the 1930s, and it gave way to waves that were kept slicked down or combed back that made side-parting hairstyles immensely popular. It is very common for these vintage hairstyles to make a comeback in fashion today. Here are the popular 1930s men's. What I want to talk to you about is the bob. A common sight when watching silent movies and black and white films made in the 1930s is a grown man sporting a bob. Think the Three Stooges and you will visualize a man with a haircut to a single length around his head. The bangs, the tail, and the side sections are all the same length, with nearly equal coverage of all sides of the head. The bob was first used as a men's haircut back in the 1930s before it was later revived as a women's hairstyle. What I'd like to share with you is the off-centered part. Another easily recognized hairstyle in the 1930s is the short cropped haircut for men, styled into an off-centered part all the way to the center of the crown. This type of hairstyle is often done with lots of pomade worked into the hair to make it lie flat and enhance the straight line down the crown. Think Clark Gable, and you can image short hair neatly combed to one side. If the hair is a bit longer at the front, it is combed back to the crown, leaving the forehead clear.
Less people were sewing in the 1930s. This was the beginning of the ready-to-wear fashion age. However, times were hard and things were scarce during this decade as well. Since the 1930s was a decade of recovering from the 1929 Great Depression and the stock market crash, companies started researching and implementing cheaper means of clothing manufacturing. New materials that were cheaper to process have been created during this decade to replace more expensive materials. Edward III was a major figure during these times for unusual male fashion. He is seen in short, baggy knee pants known as +4s, along with a round-necked schoolboy sweater. Underneath, he was wearing a white butterfly collar shirt with a black tie. On his head, he was wearing a grandpa-style hat. Both men and boys wore full three-piece suits during this time when attending formal occasions such as weddings. Similar to in present day, these were made with broader shoulders and a more masculine-looking pattern than in earlier years. The alternative was usually something along the line of a sweater vest and knickers and trousers. Suits during the early 1930s were close cut to use less fabric. The Great Depression started a conservative fashion climate. Extravagant colors were used in bad taste. Colors like gray, brown, beige, or light blue were more acceptable. Men's suits were fitted with single or double-breasted lapels, button fastenings, and wide shoulders. Wool, flannel, tweeds, and linens, depending on the season, were the most popular fabric choices. Knitted waistcoats were also popular in men. Men wore shirts of plain or striped cotton with attached collars. Trousers had straight, wide hems turned up with center creases and cloth color that matched jackets and waistcoats. In the later 1930s, with a return in the greater economic stability, cuts of men's suits were more generous. Jackets with heavily padded shoulders and fuller sleeves were popular. Businessmen wore tapered trousers, whereas younger men wore flowing trousers with long coats in the zoot suit style. Buttons were used to fasten men's garments in the early 1930s.
For the ladies during this decade was fairly modest, but perhaps a little more revealing in contrast to other times in history. A basic swimsuit made during these times looked much like a one-piece short tank outfits that are popular today. A similar style of swimsuit during the time is one that is made with an overskirt to help hide a bulging stomach and a larger size. Some of the suits were made in this era were two-pieced as well, and often accented with a wide beach hat or a bow around the waist. Backs on women's swimsuits were low during this decade. Suits were made from colors such as ivory, white, cream, gray, black, and buff. Sometimes they were accented with touches of red. Hats during this time for women were either wide-brimmed, crowned, or of a sailor style. Smaller pert hats were also created during this period of time. Also, between 1935 and 1939, the use of what is called a crochet snood and scarf were also used. Most women used them to hold the back of the hair up. The hats that men wore during this decade included a variety of different berets and top hats. One of the most famous male hats varieties was the fedora, which is made of soft material, dented lengthwise, and has a tapered rim. In the later 1940s, Humphrey Borat wore a fedora in Casablanca.
Were less extravagant for the most part, but during the 1930s, however, you could still be between haves and nots of this time. Some of the more affluent type of dress was present by models in the issues of the women's magazine Good Housekeeping. You can see some of the businesslike and the influence in these simple outfits if you go back in April 1930s issue. Models in some of the photos display simple yet feminine outfits of two-piece v-neck cardigan, simple blouse, and two down-bright skirts. Other photos presented in the issue of Good Housekeeping showed off long, free-flowing dresses with low v-neck necklines. The dresses are known often as the 1930s trousseau. These particular outfits are what many people would perhaps in past time with T or Lincoln in. Each of these dresses were designed to show off women's most feminine features, tight or snug at the waist and then bowing slightly out. Most of these dresses are either slightly gathered or pleated. The pattern of many of the early 1930s dresses they were made to know as the cross-cut bias style. Some of them are one piece while others are centered to the short, elegant jacket. Today many people would consider wearing these styles of dresses to formal and semi-formal dinners. Although women did not back on the number of the style of clothes, ladies' hats were still an integral part of the ladies' wardrobe. These sleeves of most of the 1930s dresses and outfits referred in these articles are the 3/4 length or shorter. The hemline of most of the outfits during these times were cut between the knees and the shins. Colors of the fashionable ladies wore in the 1930s were different colors such as red, navy, white, and black. One of the most famous fashion influences of the 1930s was the Coco Channel. Another one of the time was the Madeleine Venomant, who was a French designer.